In Episode 1, Coruscant is mostly depicted at a distance. We're flying over it or we see it out of windows. And in Episode 2, George wanted to get down to street level.
It started with this big, aerial car chase where we start to go down to the street. We start to see, okay, well, this is what the rest of Coruscant, the inhabitants, what do they do? And you start to get a hint of, okay, well, there's much more to this than just the governmental planet.
The chase begins in the new city where the buildings are much taller and more modern. And we drop down through an older city. There was an industrial area and kind of a seedy nightclub area. Most of the speeder chase is synthetic elements of one kind or another. What we have from live action photography is Ewan hanging off of the probe droid. We have Anakin in the yellow speeder, and then he catches up with Obi-Wan. We have Zam Wessel in her speeder. And that's about it for set pieces until the crash. When the speeder crashes, we had a little bit of a street scene set piece, and then the entrance to the nightclub.
She went into the club, Master.
The design challenge there was to try something kind of a spin on the cantina sequence from the original Star Wars, and then see what we can do with it. And instead of making it so chaotic and sort of really kind of interesting in a seedy way that we saw on Tatooine, we wanted to take the approach that, okay, well, this is a festive place. This is still, a place where, young people go and celebrate and stuff, and you have all this intrigue going around it. And so we, of course, filled it with color and sound and music.
That set was under construction for probably 6 or 8 weeks, gradually building it up. Took quite a while to get it to its shootable state. And we shot on it for, I think it was less than a whole day. I think it was about 2/3 of a day. And then the next day they were tearing it all apart. Large parts of it were going into the dumpster. And it just seems like such a tragic thing, so much effort goes into those sets. But we needed that space to put the next set in.
Dex's Diner is a perfect example of where we took iconic American images and then pulled it together, for a real important story point. It was a really fun thing because George wanted literally a diner, and he knew exactly what he wanted. Some of the earlier designs were quite expansive. We had circular ones, we had seating in different arrangements, but it all became a little bit too exotic. They're not the classic American diner that we're all familiar with. And so we actually went very simple and just literally took the original design of what we would see in a diner and then just modified it a little bit, put in a couple robots, set it at the bottom of this gigantic street on Coruscant, and you had this fantastic environment. The Jedi Library was a really fun challenge in the sense that, how do you create this information resource for all of the Republic? Basically, this is where every piece of information is stored. And so we took that idea and really, again, exaggerate the scale and then really try to think forward and say, well, what kind of technology would they use to store information? Of course, holograms are, already been established. So we decided, okay, these are all holographic databases. And then the next task was then to, okay, visually, how do you convey that so we can actually understand it? And we started looking at research of different libraries through all of history. In many ways, even though you only see such a small glimpse of it in the film, all this rich history was all figured out and planned. Depending on what George wants for the story, we start pulling bits and pieces of it. But if you dive into it, every little piece in terms of the structure of where these locations were and the look of them all tied together. So there's this incredible sense of history for the planet. And that's what really grounds the look of all of these films to make it look very believable.
The first movie I ever saw in the cinema could possibly have been Star Wars Episode IV. And I went to see it with my brother after school one day. We were going through I lived in a town called Crieff, and my mum and dad were taking us to a big town in Scotland called Glasgow. And we were going to see Star Wars. And we were going to see it mainly because my uncle was in it.
And action.
My scope shows the tower, but I can't see the exhaust port.
Are you sure the computer can hit it?
And it was the first time I'd ever seen him in the cinema, in a movie. So we were very excited, and I remember being picked up outside the school gates by my mum and dad, and we got in the car and we were really excited all the way there. And then we sat down, just excited to see Uncle Dennis on the big screen. And then we got Star Wars as well, which blew us completely away.
All right, I got a malfunction, Luke.
I've got a malfunction, Luke. I can't stay with you.
Okay, Wedge, get clear.
Sorry.
Let him go. Stay on the leader.
So that was my first ever film, and I was 6.
As we go into episode 2, we revisit Naboo, and we actually get to see sort of the evolution of the planet. And it was key to the story because this is where Anakin and Padmé really start to form their relationship. And it was really interesting in the sense that, all the other planets, we start to hint at a little bit of the mystery and the darkness. On Naboo, we actually want to exaggerate sort of the romance and the beauty and the light to contrast what was starting to happen in the rest of the Star Wars universe. There's a dangerous trap in how do you create an incredible paradise, because everybody has a different idea of what that could be. And one of our goals was to really ground it into something that we're very familiar with. Of course, nature is an obvious one, because everybody loves nature, hopefully. And then how do you build enough architecture in there so that everything looks like it's in harmony? And so we decided to create architecture that was really perfectly situated into the natural surroundings. And Lake Como in Italy was actually a really good foundation for that, because it's a beautiful resort, a beautiful place to visit for vacations. And we just basically took that idea of that lake and then exaggerated it on a planetary scale, and that becomes the new Naboo. One of the environments on Naboo that we exaggerated the lighting and the architecture to make it more romantic is the Queen's Palace, her sort of secret retreat where she and Anakin actually start to fall in love. And what we did there was we really start to create a visual look with the lighting, so that it's always idyllic, it's always afternoon light, it's always perfect. You get a sense that it never thunderstorms on Naboo in this part of the world, that everything is always perfect, the lighting is always ideal.
That's beautiful.
That was one way to do it. The other one was to take the color palette of the flowers that we see around there and really just amp them up so everything was in full bloom, everything was in spring. And it's all these little subtle visual cues that you start to think that, okay, this planet is pretty special. I mean, it really represents paradise in that sense. And then these are Naboo buses. I like this one. One of the really interesting design challenges for Naboo was how do you merge technology with this very beautiful, peaceful society? The minute you start introducing vehicles and other high-tech things into a very naturalistic setting, there's a tendency to transform the environment into something dark, just by the nature of what it is. And one of the real challenges for Naboo was, okay, how do you blend those two? How do you create technology in terms of the vehicles and the spaceships and the architecture to, in many ways, complement the natural surroundings of their planet? And we went back and decided to treat everything as jewelry almost as artwork. So every little piece, every little detail in terms of the door frames, the doorknobs, all the way up to spaceships, everything was treated with the care of an artist in terms of everything being designed and handcrafted, hand-built, hand-lovingly manufactured. And that kind of gave it the perfect blend where you actually saw beautiful trees and this technology that actually became art. And so it was really blending art with nature. And that was one way to overcome sort of the dangers of how do you make a society very believable and yet without turning too dark.
We're in the middle of the desert. I've been here about 5 or 6 times before, this particular spot. Everything is exactly the same because a lot of this stuff was just left and it was still here.
I mean, one of the interesting things of, designing worlds that kind of have a story arc over 3 films over a span of, 20 plus years is really figure out, okay, how do you make the designs work? And in episode 2, when Anakin goes back to visit his home, the design of the architecture and the homestead all look exactly the same, but you have to give it a little bit of a sense that time has passed, history has happened. And we did that by just, slightly altering stuff. So, for instance, when you go back and visit Watto's shop, it's not exactly the same environment, but you still have the same sense of history, because when you go back, you are in some ways seeing the evolution of the planet as well.
Shut, Watto. Ting mi cha sa hopa.
Tatooine is an interesting world in that we get a sense that it's a very old world. Old in the sense that the people that are living there have been there a long time, so the structures have been built up over time. And how do you create sort of a design aesthetic for a people that are kind of, basically just surviving? They're kind of on the outskirts of the known universe. Knowing that, they do have high technology, they have spaceships and stuff like that. What would they do? How would they modify their materials to create these gigantic structures? But maybe they don't have the building materials that we're used to. The whole design philosophy was kind of all about mud bricks, taking that and exaggerating the scale.
And we're set.
And action!
Jamel, Adam.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, once more.
One of the really fun design challenges was the Tusken Raiders. We were exposed to some of that in episode 4, but we didn't quite see, what they were about, their homestead and stuff like that. In episode 2, we actually got to go and really explore what they were in terms of their camp. And the design brief from George was that, these are, of course, nomads. They roam the desert. And the challenge was to really, how do you create sort of architecture and buildings and homes and stuff that kind of fit that lifestyle. So again, we went into research. We started looking at, North American Indians, what do they do when they're sort of cleaning up and moving from location to location? And so we took the idea of, maybe it's like something like a teepee structure, something that can be easily broken down, but yet is, at night can become a home. And so we started looking at that and started saying, well, how can we take advantage of the exotic life that's on Tatooine? There's some of these gigantic creatures. And we thought, well, instead of, wood for the teepees, how about if there were giant tusks? And that started to create this sort of this weird dome-like shape that then we put animal skin on top of it. And by creating these teepee structures with these giant, enormous tusks, it started to create this very iconic image of teeth and flesh. And it was perfectly suited for what the Tusken Raiders were all about, because they were very aggressive, savage people. And so design works beautifully when you can have those elements imbued in the visual in addition to sort of the bigger scheme of, how does it actually work? When we saw Tatooine on episode 2, it was really well done. I mean, again, for me, being such a Star Wars fan, I love playing in this universe, and to see more and more of that get on the screen is a real joy.
Hello. How might I be of service? I am C.
3PO.
The Maker. Oh, Master Annie. I knew you would return.
When we visit the planet Geonosis in episode 2, we start to see sort of this very interesting world, and we get to understand who created the droids. And it was really a fascinating idea from George, where you have these very high-tech robots, and yet they're being created by a very primitive race. And so the design was really to take, how do you create that? How do you contrast the two? Because it had the potential to create something visually very stunning, where you have sort of the society of this hive mentality of these insect type characters, and yet they're creating this very elaborate, almost cutting edge technology at this time, which are the droid army, and the factories that go into that.
We wanted this sense of chaos with the droid factory. Again, there was a really good pre-visualization that existed for that, but it had been cut up and rearranged in the editing process, and it kind of was a little bit confusing what was going on. So we actually took a group of our artists and we went to see a car factory here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we also went to a foundry over in the East Bay to take a lot of references and textures and photographs of real looking stuff. A lot of the machinery and the conveyor belts that they're on are all computer graphics, but a lot of the world of the factory, all the distant things, are big miniatures that we made. Again, just trying to mix it up. The combination of all these real textures that we'd shot and then trying to plan, exactly what is going on here and what is really happening was all aimed to try and make it sort of feel a bit more real to the audience watching.
Our foundation is always research. We went and looked at all these different kinds of insect dwellings, ants, termites, and see what they would build. And all we do is we take that and exaggerate the scale. And so we really, for the Geonosans, we took the idea of termite dwellings and then started to really grow them in a way that was really fantastic and changing the scale quite a bit. And then What you do from there is then you start adding in bits of high technology. Like, for instance, the conference room of the Geonosians, where you see their high-tech war room. Everything's very organic on the outside. It's all like mud and rock. And it's the simplicity of merging those two iconic images that make the design very successful.
We're visiting a planet we've never seen before, so there's a little more freedom to kind of go off to create something interesting and different.
There's another big set piece, which is the big arena battle, the execution arena, where we see all these crazy creatures and monsters try to eat our heroes.
And then the Jedi show up and a big battle ensues. We have thousands of droids, hundreds of Jedi battling them. The Geonosians flee. The clone troopers show up. It's a giant free-for-all.
I'd taken some maps of this area and I drew a little diagram of what I thought the Battle of Geonosis would look like. So this happens here, this happens here, this happens here. I used that with the maps to say, okay, here's where I'm going to shoot this part of the battle and here's where I'm going to shoot that part of the battle. You know, it worked out pretty well. I mean, there was great previs, and I really felt like, you know, one of the satisfying parts of the experience was the previs guys, when they started seeing the shots, were just so happy with what we were coming up with.
It's weird because as an actor, you don't really think about the action part of a film being all too important, or, you know, important to your character at least. And in this, it is, and it's just so exciting, you know, because you know what it looks like on screen when they're all lit up and the sounds are going. It's just cool. Nick Gillard is the fight master. Brilliant man. He choreographs the fights. He's just really good at what he does. He brings a story arc to the fights. The fights sort of become their own character. And that's all credited to Nick. Heaps of fun, too. And he cares so much, so he's on set every day making sure that everything goes right and that there's no variable for any chance of that something might go wrong. And if something does, he's the first one in there. In terms of the lightsaber fights, it's all choreographed, and every move is distinct and pre-planned. He spends hours just premeditating how every, you know, the angle of the saber should look. So he I think, picks and chooses from so many different types of martial arts and ways of fighting with swords, and sort of comes to his own medium and his own way of fighting, the Jedi way of fighting.
Somebody asked me, I can't remember when, they said, what's it like when you work in front of a blue screen, you don't see anything, and there's nothing behind the camera, and you're not getting anything coming back from behind the camera, because there isn't anything there. And I said, oh, I've often had that experience with a lot of my colleagues.
It's hard because you take your attention off of the dialogue and sometimes off of what you're doing, and just trying to remember, you know, I've got so many different marks, and I wave my hand here and that moves there, and that's really supposed to be, you know, a she, and he's supposed to be something else, and that's an alien. You've got so many more variables to play with that's distracting, and sometimes lose your place.
What's my comm link doing on the floor? I could use a force to grab that, couldn't I?
There's something very rewarding about cracking a scene with other actors and shooting the scene and having achieved it. And with this, you're doing lines against a blue curtain, and it's really hard work. I mean, it's difficult to make that believable. I don't know if I have.
I think blue screen acting is maybe the purest form of acting, because it's like being a little kid in a cardboard box and thinking it's a spaceship. And I mean, that's really the point you have to get to.
We were working with these creatures, and, you know, there's a couple of scenes I wanted to be able to focus on where it is, you know? Because I think an audience would subconsciously recognize that, you know?
I don't have anything else, but credits will do fine.
You're always in a state of having to believe something that's not really there.
You're just remembering the lines and saying them, really. or not remembering the lines and trying to say them, as the case may be.
You will not win this time. What's your name, Dooku? I want to say it. Okay.
It's really a lot more thought. I mean, you have to imagine everything you're setting around you, sometimes even characters, and it's a very different skill.
For me, that's fun. I can do that because I did that as a kid. I mean, if you watch Disney movies and you watch Bugs Bunny cartoons and, you know, I pretended to be Yosemite Sam and everybody else, so my imagination's pretty fertile. I don't have a problem with, you know, being whatever somebody wants me to be. I can go with it.
It is done then. I have to say, it then became liberating because, you know, when you're kids and you come out of the cinema having seen a great cowboy film and you kind of start giving it all that, you know, you're pretending there's a horse there. You're just, it's absolute pure imagination.
There's always a bigger fish.
I don't know, it's, at times it feels like you're in acting class sitting in a chair with your buddy. You know, oh, she went that way.
Where are you going? He went that way.
So you feel like a little bit of an ass when you're doing it, but they say it works.
I'm talking about the frustrations of doing it and whatever. They're real frustrations, and but they're made worthwhile when you see the finished product, definitely.
It is magic, of course. It is magic. Magic can be created in many ways, obviously, and it's like a conjurer goes in front of an audience and says, look, nothing up this sleeve, nothing up that sleeve. Now, come with me into my magic world.